Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Victoria Mattingly, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the SIOP Conversation Series podcast, where we talk with leading industrial organizational psychologists. Welcome to episode number 36, where we'll be talking about the science for a changing workplace. And the views and opinions expressed in today's conversation series are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of SIOP. Today, our guests will be bringing fresh perspectives on using IO best practices to guide the use of AI in client organizations. Welcome to the SIOP Conversation Series, Colin Willis.
Thank you very much for having me. Really excited to have this conversation today.
We're thrilled to have you. Dr. Colin Willis received his PhD in psychology from Colorado State University. He is an IO psychology program manager at HireVue, a vendor of AI and technology enabled selection instruments. Colin's work has focused on using IO best practices to guide the use of AI in client organizations. From this work, Colin has grown several areas of practice to lead thinking on the ethical use of AI. He's developed an active multidisciplinary program of research across academia and technology to investigate neurodiversity and hiring outcomes. Recognizing the intersection of inclusivity, new technologies, and emerging regulations of employment decision tools, Colin layered in an interest in law to begin collaborating with lawmakers to advocate for how AI can be used to remove bias in organizational decision making within a thoughtful legal framework. His expertise furthermore informs inclusive product improvements and consulting practices at HireVue. Colin, we're so glad for you to join us today.
Thank you. That sounds pretty impressive, huh?
It does sound impressive. It does sound impressive. And we're gonna ask a little bit about your background in a moment, but I'd be amiss to not say how we were advising buddies. We had the
We
same
were.
advisor back in grad school, and
Yep.
Colin and his partner were even kind enough to let me stay with them when I was traveling back and forth in my last few years of grad school. And it's just such a thrill to see, how your career has grown over time, and to be on this podcast now together. It's just such a joy for me.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I have this like crystallized memory of I think it was probably my first year of grad school, and we were in Kurt's lab, like that in the Clark building, and you would like just put together this like really beautiful lab manual and like all these processes and procedures about how the lab was going to be run, and I was sitting there like, oh my god, what have I done? Like like huge imposter syndrome. Like I can't keep up with these people. Like everyone's so impressive, and I'm just like this like baby grad student, and it's really cool to after all these years kind of come back and see that we're both still in it.
I love it. I love it. Well, to start our conversation, we'd love to hear about your journey as an IO psychologist. So, how did you get involved in the field, and what spurred your interest in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, for sure. So it all kind of actually goes back to college. I went to a small liberal arts college where IO psychology wasn't even really a thing. So I kind of discovered it on my own, and really where I my majors in psychology, so I gotten some kind of exposure to it through that. But I had this kind of formative experience actually tutoring writers in our writing center, and I really enjoyed the training aspect of training new tutors. And that became, something like, oh, I really like this. I want to see where else I can do that. And IO psychology came up as sort of this thing that you could do where you could study training and the science behind it. And that led to me looking for grad schools in IO psychology, and that led me to Kurt as kind of the training aficionado of the field, and managed to get lucky and get into Colorado State and be able to work with him, and that brought me into grad school. At that point, I spent a couple years doing that kind of research, and then started to really discover this love of statistics and automation, and the ability to use some coding and scripting to automate data cleaning and data restructuring, and that kind of led me to selection in a kind of roundabout way, as I was sort of becoming less, less interested in training, more interested in, kind of this technology piece of what I could do with the field, and that led me to HireVue and artificial intelligence and all of that. So it's kind of this big arc of, kind of getting with training and then coming out with selection. So kind of like got there.
For those of us less familiar with the concept of AI, particularly in the context of selection, could you provide a few examples of AI enabled instruments that you use at HireVue?
Yeah, so we'll take a step back and just talk a little bit about kind of like what artificial intelligence is, especially what it means to us at HireVue, because it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So really, artificial intelligence comes out of the same family of statistics that we learn about in school. We're looking at what we call like supervised learning, which would be something like regression, or unsupervised learning, like exploratory factor analysis, where we're kind of clustering data together. Fundamentally, artificial intelligence is working in similar ways, but we're going to combine that with different kinds of technology. And then AI lets us unpack new kinds of data and be able to use that in ways we haven't been able to in the past. So a couple of examples from HireVue, our bread and butter is our interview-based assessments, which are going to use natural language processing. So kind of in a nutshell, what we do is we record a candidate's response to an interview question that gets transcribed into text, and then we use a natural language processing algorithm to break that text up into variables, which we call features, and then use that essentially as predictors to predict an outcome of interest. So typically we're going to train those kind of NLP features on a human-made rating of competency. So we'll have a trained analyst look at an interview response and say, this person is exhibiting advanced problem solving to this question that asks them about how do they solve a problem. And then we're going to use that interview text to predict that rating. That's how we build up our interview-based rating algorithms. We also use AI in a couple other places, for example, in our game-based assessments, where we're going to take traditional measures of things like cognitive ability from the literature and put some gamification elements on them to make them a little more engaging for candidates. We're going to use machine learning there to kind of pull out and extract gameplay features and use that to predict cognitive ability. And then lastly, our simplest form of artificial intelligence is actually in our chatbot. We have a chatbot that helps candidates find jobs that they're interested in, and we have an NLP kind of algorithm there that honestly just helps the computer understand what the person is saying. So if we ask a yes or no question and someone responds, "Yep," the NLP algorithm understands that as a positive response to the question, and then can kind of keep moving forward in the chat. So all kinds of different ways, right? It's all used in a way that is very purpose driven, very guided by IO principles. And one thing that I always call out too is all of the algorithms that we use are static, which means that we've sort of frozen them into place. They don't change, they don't pull in new data, they're not dynamically learning. We've kind of set them in a kind of steady state so that all candidates are being compared against the same standards as everyone else. So it's not, the algorithm isn't changing or kind of getting out of control at any point in time. So following best practices in candidate selection.
Yeah, can you expound just a little bit more on that, specifically, you know, AI and natural language processing, machine learning, like these are all like terms that IOs love to throw around, but like I'm just gonna be honest and vulnerable. I don't know too much about those
Mm-hmm.
areas, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, what do you see, as some of like the foundational intersections of AI and IO, and some of those IO best practices that you just mentioned that kind of are built into the algorithms that y'all use?
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple different things, right? So it's I think for a long time in the field, right? Now I'll say a long time, but I remember in grad school we would talk about big data, or is data science coming to take our jobs, and kind of this fear around, we've been sort of the scientists in the workplace using statistics to help understand and give data-driven recommendations back to our organizations. And that's still really, fundamentally what's going on. We just have new tools in our toolkit, right? That's really where artificial intelligence and machine learning come into play. To a large extent, they're just helping push the boundaries in the statistics that we typically use. They're helping us uncover kinds of data that we wouldn't have been able to use before, right? Being able to like systematically look at interviews is not something we've been able to really do in the past, but now we can record interview responses and really study them down to the words that people are saying, and change features about how interviews are conducted, like how much time you have, how much practice you have, be able to really systematically look at it in combination with the technology that drives that, right? Computers and webcams, things like that. So it's in my mind, it's a combination of advancing the statistics as well as uncovering new kinds of data that we can look at as scientists.
Interesting. I'm gonna ask you to put your sales hat on now, Colin, from our first comment. So this is from Dr. Leroy, Dr. Roy, a friend of mine, who's a big AI enthusiast, but does not think it should be used in hiring at all. Onboarding and talent management and development, yes, but not hiring. What is your response to this comment?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's reasonably a lot of concern about artificial intelligence, and I think largely because it's something that's still unfamiliar to a lot of people. Something that has come out of the EEOC and the DOJ is a reminder that artificial intelligence is a tool and is still subject to the same laws and guidelines that any other tool is when it's used in selection. So, following from the same principles we would apply to typical assessments that we would use, job analysis is still going to help us align the test to the job. We can still look at and should look at our adverse impact. We should still run validation studies to prove out the use of the tool and what we're measuring in there. So ultimately, it's helping us, get at different kinds of data we haven't been able to before. And we'll probably get into this a little bit later. But being able to collect and systematically look at interview responses is a huge step forward in interviewing, which is by far the most common form of way organizations are making hiring decisions. But we can now apply the scrutiny that we would to a typical assessment to that practice. So I see a lot of benefit in being able to balance IO best practices with some of the technology that and kind of the information that AI lets us glean from different kinds of decisions.
Especially when we're thinking about things like big data and also bias. I know there's a lot of talk right now about how algorithms themselves can have bias built in, but that's why, like you were saying before, about they're not in that learning mode, and so they're not able to learn biases that they're seeing in the data. Isn't it so interesting we're anthropomorphizing?
Yeah, right.
Like, what a
Yep.
world we live in. What a
And
world.
it's funny because it's the algorithms really aren't any different than I mean they are to an extent, but they're fundamentally very similar to a scoring algorithm that we would apply to a pencil and paper test, right? We're just expanding the data set into hundreds of thousands of features versus 10 or 20 specific variables.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Okay, so as AI's impact on the workforce increases, especially in terms of recruitment and advancement decisions, based on your knowledge and experience, what are some insights about the ethical use of AI and what are some potential pitfalls?
Yeah. So, I kind of want to address, I think, something, right out, hit the nail on the head with one example, and that's really around HireVue. And, people may remember us from the days where we had something called facial action units in our algorithms. What people may not know is that how or why we changed our stance on using facial action units. As a little bit of background, we were using, before 2020 or so, a technology called Affectiva that allowed us to map facial geometry and then detect how the face moved in a video analytics format. And we were able to use those features as part of our predictors to predict job outcomes. That was something we were able to validate. So we were able to show that it was related to the job, and we could show the variance that it helped explain. A lot of customers bought us because of that technology, but starting in 2019, we started to get, essentially, hearing from multiple different sources that this was something that people were seeing as, feeling uncomfortable with or potentially unethical. One key example in my work is we had an organization called Integrate Autism Employment Advisors approach our then CEO and say, hey, we have a shared customer. They're implementing your assessments, but they're concerned about the impact these assessments will have on the autistic population. And they've asked us to sort of review your assessment and give feedback. And so we'd love to talk to you more about what's going on. And so they share their concerns, right? If we're measuring, facial geometry, autistic candidates aren't going to move their face as much. If we're measuring intonation, autistic candidates are known for being pretty monotone. If we're getting body language, same kind of idea. So all these really good points, right? That was kind of brought to us. At the same time, there's some candidate concerns coming through the media, as well as advances in natural language processing that was allowing us to sort of see, could we kind of recapture some of that variance in the scientific lens or technology lens to drop it entirely. And we made the decision to drop FAUs completely from all of our algorithms in 2020. And that was at the expense of some customers who were unhappy that we were going to do that because that's why they bought us. But we felt it was the right decision, and we considered multiple sources of evidence to make that decision. And I think, in my mind, that's such a key part of ethical AI, right? Listening to the broader stakeholders, not just our customers, but people, candidates, and subject matter experts, and then making a reasonable decision based off of that to sort of move the technology forward in a better direction. So I want to start with that example because I think that always comes up when people hear HireVue. But beyond that, some of the things that I think about too are really just aligning to best practices. So, as I said before, we have, just because AI is kind of this new cutting edge technology, doesn't mean that our tried and true best practices from the field don't apply anymore. Job analysis is still going to help us establish the linkage between the test content and the job. We can still and should monitor for adverse impact of different kinds, to still validate and do criterion validation studies and prove out the efficacy of the assessment. So those are all huge components, right, in ethically using a sort of artificial intelligence solution in the workplace context. And then I think lastly, kind of moving off of the best practices, we're seeing a lot of emerging AI regulations, right, at the different kind of state and city levels, and we're getting new themes around what do people want in terms of kind of new regulations that go beyond our traditional guidelines from the Uniform Guidelines and the Civil Rights Act and the ADA. Those really center around the candidates, providing notice to candidates, telling them what's about to happen, transparency around the test, what's being measured, giving them the ability to consent to the process, giving them feedback, all these things that probably sound good to an organizational researcher, right? These all sound kind of pretty aligned with pretty standard organizational research practices, but in the selection context, those things are pretty rare. Employers are really concerned, and our customers are really concerned about giving candidates feedback around telling them what the test is about, giving those kinds of disclosures. But ethically, it's, in my mind, it's a huge step forward because we're starting to treat candidates as people and giving them the information they need to be intentional about the process that they're going to go through as they join certain companies. So I think it's a really big step forward ethically.
And just candidate experience, I feel like that sometimes just gets lost when it comes to IO best practices in selection processes. And so to be able to enhance that candidate experience with that transparency, I think you're absolutely right, really can be really effective, really powerful. Colin, in your opinion, how can AI be used to remove biases in organizational decision making?
Yeah, let me give, I'll answer that kind of by an example. But I think at a really high level, the what I see as the most promising practice here is that AI allows us to scale IO best practices in ways that we otherwise couldn't or be really hard to do. So interviewing is, of course, something that's very near and dear to my heart, given where I work and what a lot of the research that I do. A traditional face-to-face interview is still our most common selection method. There are a lot of things that go into interviewing well that are not necessarily job related. So getting yourself to the interview location, putting on the right clothes, giving a firm handshake, making eye contact, knowing to make small talk, helping the interviewer interview you, right? Kind of knowing that meta piece of the interview where you're kind of interviewing yourself, understanding, and inferring from poor questions what's going on. At the same time, on the interviewer side, you're going to be asking kind of like what we would call unstructured questions, and not right in the right order, and giving candidates more time or less time, and it creates this very unstructured, unfair process from candidate to candidate because you're essentially getting different information from each candidate, and then at the end of the day trying to decide who feels kind of best to you. And so that's something that the field has tried to intervene on in a long time, right? We know that structured interviewing is a huge step forward over unstructured interviewing. We've seen with autistic candidates that structured interviews are a huge step forward as well. But there's still a lot of different things that we can do to move the needle forward. And that's a lot of the work that I'm doing with Integrate and studying neurodivergent candidates and their experience going through artificial intelligence. some of the things that we can do to help remove bias is really changing that face-to-face interview ecosystem from a land filled with what I've called before like psychological wilderness, right? These heuristics of hiring managers making kinds of different decisions off the cuff and going by what they feel, to something that's highly standardized and structured. So not only are in a what we call an asynchronous video interview format, candidates are getting the same questions in the same order. They can record their response at whatever time is most comfortable to them, so you don't have to leave work. You can record it from the comfort, place you find most comfortable. So if you're someone who's neurodivergent and you want a very quiet, non-stimulating experience, interview experience, you can do that from your bedroom or wherever you're most comfortable. Our platform allows candidates to practice, allows them to retry answers, to pause in between questions, and do all sorts of things that allow you to make the interview experience as less stressful as possible. So those all are kind of big things that help build into a kind of a more equitable, fair interviewing process. And then at the same time, as we look towards further removing bias in the interviewing system, we can look at different outcomes at scale. So I'm looking at how autistic candidates respond to improved instructions relative to the general population, how they perform on our game-based assessments, how much time they need to prepare for the interview, so that they bring these back into the product and scale all of these findings that we find from the research to improve the product and make the whole technology stack more equitable and more accessible for candidates in a way that you couldn't do in a typical organization where you'd have to go manager by manager and give them all these different kinds of training and tips and best practices and then help them sustain that change, right? If we do that through technology, those changes just stick because it's delivered by technology versus a person.
Before I ask our last question, I did want to nudge the audience watching right now. If y'all have any questions for Colin, questions about AI and the selection process, or just the science of a changing world in general, be sure to plunk those in the comments of whatever you're watching this on right now. And we can see those. We can post them on the screen. But we'd love to hear some questions from the audience. My last question is related to bias and how AI can help debias some of these decisions. How can we continue to build trust in AI, both among employers as well as candidates?
Yeah, I think, at a high level, employers and candidates want different things. And in my experience, what I've seen through other vendors and honestly through our literature is we have a very employer focus in building trust. So, an employer is going to look at scientific rigor, security, oversight of the process, whether audits have been done, technical documentation. So, what sort of validation studies exist? What are the average impact results across different customers? That's all the kind of information that a savvy employer is going to be looking at to build trust in the system, right? So, they're going to be looking from a very scientific, technical lens to understand that. Candidates, generally speaking, that's not what's going to help them build trust, right? That's way above their pay grade, and that's something that I think all vendors are learning at different speeds right now around how to really build trust with candidates, and should we be building trust with candidates? And that's something that HireVue believes strongly in, is really reaching the candidate. Some of the things that we've found is really, familiarity helps build trust with candidates. So sometimes the asynchronous video interview format is sort of unfamiliar and uncomfortable. So getting candidates comfortable with that process. Face validity is something that's really key. So knowing that the questions are job related, that the games or the other assessments really feel like this is something I would do on the job or makes sense to why I'd be measured on something like this. Also key. Feedback, transparency. We have different kinds of feedback reports that we can give candidates that tell them about how they did. Sadly, most employers don't turn those on because they're so afraid of giving that kind of feedback to a candidate, which is something that just disappoints us time and time again, but it's there and available for people to turn on. But really, I mean, there's a lot of work here to do on the candidate side. And I think to really sum it up, it's all about meeting candidates where they're at and treating them like people. And that's something that, as we kind of go forward and really think about candidate experience as an area to really explore, is how do we systematically really reach out to a candidate and give them the information that they need to make them feel comfortable with the process that they're going through.
Which is so interesting, because I think when people think of AI and machine learning, and they're thinking about the dehumanization of the process. And whereas I think a big theme that you've brought across in this conversation is it's actually how do we build more, how do we humanize the process even more and use these tools to humanize the process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always gonna be a balance, right? I don't think there's a world in which AI should or would be doing decision making or the end-to-end process. Really, it should be about surfacing data in a way that helps organizations make the right decision in the least biased way possible. And so that's a really key piece of the whole thing is we as we think about assessments as linking the candidate skills to jobs and building a bridge between those two. That's a huge thing that assessments can do, AI powered or not. That is different than a traditional organizational hiring practice where it's just like, oh, I like this candidate, I think they'll be a good fit. So there's a huge ethical KSA kind of component that builds into all of this, where if we could show candidates this is a process that really helps you find the job that's the right fit for you, where you're going to be most successful and be most valuable to the organization, and to the organization we're going to find you the candidates that are most qualified. That's a huge advantage to everybody, right? But it's not often communicated well to candidates that this is really a very strong scientifically rigorous process that's helping you get a good job.
Yeah. That still has people in there somewhere. Like it's not, someone commented, would you trust chat GPT to hire you or be responsible for promoting you?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
No,
Absolutely not. Yeah.
no,
But
no.
but to
Yep,
have the person responsible for hiring and promoting me having the right data to do that, I think
exactly.
that's very important.
Yep.
Um, this is an interesting question I'm going to put on the screen. So people can lie through to some degree. How can AI compensate for false skills reported on resumes, if at all?
hmm Yeah, and cheating comes up in various forms in customer conversations. I think people are rightfully concerned about that, and especially with the Chat GPT, things like that. It's easier to portray yourself in a way that's different than who you authentically are. Ultimately, what we found is that does serve to kind of undermine your own job search and job experience, right? If you misrepresent who you are, you're generally going to be, might get the job, might not perform well on the job. What we found in interviews as people sort of try to generate automatic, responses through, an AI engine, they just don't land as well as a real response because it's lacking that personal color and real experience, right? It's very generic sounding, so it doesn't score as well in our systems. What I've seen, and I don't really work super closely with resume screening in general, but having looked at the technology before, what I've seen as a really interesting practice is that you can map different skills that aren't in the resume itself, but are adjacent, kind of like a nomological net, and build up an web of like, well, if you said I have this skill, then you probably have this skill too, and this skill. So if you're kind of inserting skills that are unrelated or you think just kind of look good, that's not going to show up as well in the nomological net of kind of the different AI NLP technologies that are being applied to understanding the resume versus someone who's going to have a very much more consistent, grounded in reality set of skills.
That makes a ton of sense. One final question based on all the comments from our audience. So it seems like we have a lot of aspiring IO psychologists tuning in today. For those out there who are interested in, being an IO, especially an IO that works in AI, what recommendations do you have for those who would love to have a career like yours someday, Colin?
Honestly, the biggest thing that I think set me apart up for success going into moving from grad school into my career was the not I had good statistical skills, but not we have a data science team that does our AI for the most part, and I can do some of it, but not to the extent that they can. But what I can do well is explain it, and I can explain it to a customer, to a candidate, to my friends, family, and that is a huge piece of being successful in this field, especially as an IO psychologist, where we're going to be interacting with these tools, but not necessarily building the tools, studying their inputs and their outputs, and explaining to stakeholders, businesses, why we should or shouldn't use certain technologies. That ability to really understand what the technology is doing, why it's doing what it's doing in a very sober lens is going to really set you up for success. So if you explain, a NLP algorithm is going to, extract features and pull out words and linkages between words in order to understand what a person's saying, and then that's fits into a regression equation, essentially just like a typical multiple linear regression to predict some sort of outcome. And that as an out psychologist, but you can explain fundamentally how that prediction works to a CTO or CEO, a chief human resources officer. That's what's going to set you up for success, because then you can be that trusted advisor who understands the technology and can bridge that technical aptitude with the real world applications and implications of using it. And that's, I think, by and large, where IO psychology just has tremendous value to organizations that no other field can really tap into like we can.
That translation piece is just so critical. And I feel like we don't get as much of that in grad school. So we need the grad school training to have the technical skills to do the work, understand the science. But I can't advocate for internships and applied experience enough, even if you do end up going academic, but want to do research on these topics, just to be able to translate that to a workforce context, to business leaders. I just can't agree more how critical that is and how important it is for any area of IO that one ends up in. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. To our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for tuning in. Colin, on behalf of SIOP, all of our listeners, and myself, thank you so much for an engaging and enlightening conversation and just taking the time to speak with us today.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. This was great, and I really love the series, so keep doing the good work.
Thank you. I love doing these. It's one of my highlights. Sure. Please join us for our next conversation on June 22nd at 11:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to talking to you again soon. And until next time, take care.